Long Din is the legend everyone knows. It's clean, cinematic, almost perfectly shaped for memory. One company, one storm, one day where the jungle seemed to choose a side. But there is another battle, harder to summarize, harder to turn into a single heroic image. A battle that didn't fit neatly into a headline or a parade. It lasted 26 days and nights, and it cost Australia more lives than any other encounter of the war. And before we step into that fire, if you enjoy true war stories told like a cinematic documentary, take 1 second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely motivates the author to keep digging up the most intense, forgotten chapters of history and publishing more stories like this. Because this one isn't a single thunderclap, it's a slow, grinding furnace. An industrial-scale siege fought in red dust and elephant grass, where sleep became a rumor and the night was never truly dark because the horizon kept flickering with fire. This was the debut of Centurion tanks in the Vietnamese bush, 50 tons of steel forced into a landscape that didn't want them. This was the place where artillerymen lowered their barrels and fired point-blank at human waves just meters away, and where Splinx, beehive rounds packed with thousands of steel darts, was unleashed like a mechanical storm to stop an enemy that simply would not stop coming. This was no skirmish. This was a head-on collision between Australia's best and the North Vietnamese Army's finest divisions. So, are you ready to enter the fire-base hell of Coral and Balmoral? In May 1968, the dust from the Tet Offensive had barely settled. Saigon was still breathing, but it was the breath of a city that had just survived a knife to the ribs. The enemy had proven they could strike deep, hard, and coordinated. And in the quiet that followed, NVA commanders began preparing for another decisive blow. Another surge meant to crack the capital's defenses and turn shock into collapse. To counter that, 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, was pushed north of Saigon into Bien Hoa Province. Their objective was a blocking operation under the umbrella of Operation Toan Thang, a blunt practical concept: establish a chain of fire support bases, FSBs, like corks in a bottle, intercepting NVA regiments as they moved, regrouped, or tried to slip back into position for the next strike. The Australians chose 2 strategic locations and gave them names that sounded almost gentle compared to what they would become: FSB Coral and FSB Balmoral. On paper, it looked standard: airmobile insertion, perimeter construction, guns in place, patrols out, enemy movement disrupted. Intelligence suggested the area was active, yes, but mostly a transit corridor: small guerrilla elements, scouts, harassment. There was little indication that the Australians were about to plant their flag directly on the main infiltration routes of 2 elite formations, the NVA 7th and 9th Divisions. The bush doesn't warn you when you step onto the artery of an army. It just stays green and quiet and lets you make your mistakes. The arrival at Coral on May 12th was plagued by logistical chaos. Helicopter insertions were delayed, landing zones took longer than expected to clear, dense vegetation forced men to fight the ground just to make space for a base. The day became a blur of sweat, machetes, shouted instructions, and the constant thump of rotor blades coming and going, bringing ammunition, rations, guns, and men who had no time to settle before being told to work. By sunset, Coral was only partially established, and that mattered. Australians were famous for textbook defensive perimeters: clean wire, overlapping fields of fire, trenches deep enough to swallow fear. Coral was not that. Coral was a fragmented patchwork of gun pits and shallow scrapes. Much of the infantry was still out on patrol. The core of the base, the heart where the heavy artillery sat, was dangerously exposed. Men were exhausted after a day of cutting and digging under a brutal sun, and many had not yet taken their pits to proper depth. They were building a fortress out of fatigue. What the Australians didn't know was that they were being watched. Thousands of NVA regulars were already concealed in the scrub beyond the clearing. Scouts crawled close enough to smell cigarette smoke. They marked the exact coordinates of gun lines, command posts, and the weak points in the incomplete wire. To the NVA commanders, this was a rare gift, a prestigious Allied unit caught mid-construction, with its most important weapon, the artillery, vulnerable to a swift, overwhelming ground assault. As darkness fell over the Bien Hoa bush, a deceptive silence took hold. Australians were usually the masters of the night. They were used to owning the darkness, moving through it like professionals while the enemy hesitated. That night, the roles reversed. They were no longer the hunters. They were the targets. At 3 a.m., silence wasn't merely broken. It was obliterated. Rockets and mortars began walking across the base in a precise, deliberate pattern. The impacts didn't feel random. They felt like someone had measured Coral with a ruler. The command post took hits. The mortar lines shuddered. Sandbags burst. Dirt and smoke erupted into the night. Men jerked awake to the sound of metal tearing air, then the heavy crushing thud of explosions that made the ground jump under their ribs. And then, as flares hissed upward and hung like dying stars, the second part of the plan arrived. Hundreds of NVA regulars from the 141st Regiment rose from tall grass and came forward at speed, charging the perimeter under the cover of their own falling steel. The situation was catastrophic because Coral had been occupied for only hours. The wire was incomplete. Infantry positions were thin in places and missing in others. Units that would normally be in the teeth of a defense were still too far out to intercept the initial rush. The NVA moved with a speed and aggression that stunned the defenders. defenders. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't probing. This was an attempt to tear the heart out of the fire base in one violent bite. They swarmed over the shallow pits of the 102 Field Battery. For the first time since the Second World War, Australian gunners found themselves fighting a close-quarters infantry battle to save their cannons. Artillerymen are trained to kill at distance. Targets you don't see, grids you calculate, corrections you call calmly over radio. That night, there were no grids. There were shapes moving in the smoke, 5 meters away, close enough to hear breathing and shouted Vietnamese, close enough to see the wet shine of a rifle barrel when a flare flickered. The gunners grabbed SLRS and F1 submachine guns and became infantry. Sandbags became cover, and then obstacles, and then something you climbed over in panic. Grenades flashed, turning the world into a strobe of white light and shadows. The air filled with cordite, dust, and the raw sound of men trying not to die. At one point, one of the howitzers was captured, temporarily occupied by NVA troops who used it as cover and fired into the base from inside the gun line itself, as if stealing the Australians' own steel for insult as well as advantage. Later, a gunner would describe it with a kind of disbelief that never left his voice. They were right on top of us. You couldn't see them until they were 5 meters away, and then it was just a matter of who was faster with the trigger. As the battery teetered on the edge of being overrun, the Australians did something that sounded insane on paper but made perfect sense in that moment of midnight desperation. They worked the guns anyway. While some gunners held the enemy off with small arms, others leveled the massive 105mm howitzers down, until the barrels were nearly horizontal, point blank, 30 to 50 meters. They weren't firing at a coordinate, they were firing directly into a human wave. The muzzle blast was so violent it knocked men backward. It lit faces and sandbags like lightning. The concussion slapped ears flat. High explosive rounds tore through charging ranks and ripped a sudden vacuum into the enemy's momentum. Just enough space, just enough seconds for the Australians to breathe and regroup. Coral had turned into a slaughterhouse around the gun pits, but the gunners of 102 Battery refused to abandon their posts. They clung to their steel pieces as if the guns were not equipment but anchors. If the guns fell, everything fell. And then the enemy came close enough that high explosive became dangerous for the defenders too. The NVA was hugging the positions, close, intertwined, mixed into the shadows between pits. A normal shell's blast radius risked killing Australians along with attackers. The firebase was in that deadly zone where your greatest weapon can become your greatest threat. That was when the order came. Load Splinex, the beehive rounds, officially the XM546. A Splinex shell didn't explode like a typical artillery round. It acted like a giant shotgun. The casing ruptured as it left the muzzle, releasing roughly 8,000 tiny steel flechettes, 1-inch arrows with barbed tails, spinning and hissing through the air at terrifying speed. They fanned out into a lethal cone that could shred thick undergrowth and break an infantry charge in a heartbeat. The gunners leveled the barrels again. The command was zero muzzle. Detonate immediately as it leaves the tube. The roar that followed felt cataclysmic. A crack, then a sound veterans would describe as a metallic hiss, like the air itself had been turned into blades. In the flickering light of flares, the effect was instantaneous. The first and second waves didn't just stop. They seemed to dissolve, momentum evaporating under an invisible wind of steel. It wasn't like a normal explosion, one veteran would whisper later during a debrief. It was a hiss, a giant metallic hiss after the bang, and then silence. For a few seconds, nothing moved in front of the gun. The Splinex rounds bought Coral a sanctuary carved out of chaos. They proved to the NVA commanders that the Australians would use every tool available to hold the ground, even if it meant turning artillery into a close-range death machine. But the NVA's tenacity was terrifying. They regrouped. They attacked again. By around 4 a.m., Coral reached its most critical point. The enemy had bypassed outer pits and slipped inside the wire in significant numbers. NVA soldiers crawled among bunkers, tossing grenades, moving through darkness like smoke. Confusion spread in pockets. A firebase is supposed to be layered defense, outer wire, fighting positions, depth. Coral, still unfinished, became a maze where danger could appear behind you. In the command post, officers faced the choice that haunts commanders. The enemy was too integrated into their positions. Conventional defense was no longer possible. Major Ian Whitehead and the forward observation officers understood there was one way to flush the NVA out. They had to call danger close fire, from supporting batteries and remaining functional guns at Coral. Danger close is a clinical term for something visceral. It means calling shells onto your own coordinates, raining high explosive onto your own perimeter, trusting skill and mathematics more than instinct and fear. Infantrymen were ordered to get as deep into their pits as possible, faces pressed into red dirt, arms over helmets, bodies curled tight as if making themselves smaller could make them less human to the blast. Then the supporting guns began to fire. Shells screamed overhead and detonated directly on top of Australian positions with bone-jarring cracks. The ground heaved, dust punched into the air, shrapnel pinged off steel, the pressure slapped lungs flat. In the darkness, darkness, men could hear enemy screams above them. NVA caught in the open on the surface, while Australians survived in the earth like creatures hiding from a storm. One shell off by 20 meters would have been catastrophe, but the precision of the Royal Australian Artillery was flawless. It was like a giant broom sweeping the surface of the fire base clean. When the smoke thinned and the flares burned lower, the assault had been decapitated. The enemy's hugging tactic, staying close to avoid airstrikes, had been defeated by the Australians' willingness to call fire on themselves. When the sun rose over Coral, it revealed a base that looked less like a planned position and more like a place that had been hit with a hammer all night. Men emerged from holes deafened, dirt-streaked, eyes hollow, shaking not from fear but from adrenaline crash. They were still in possession of their guns. They had survived by turning their greatest weapon into their own shield. Following the near disaster, Australian command recognized the truth. The North Vietnamese were operating with a level of firepower and coordination that demanded heavier muscle. The decision was made to deploy the Centurion tanks of C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment. It was historic and controversial. Many Allied commanders doubted these 50-ton British-built monsters could operate in the soft, unpredictable terrain of the Vietnamese bush. Vietnam chewed up vehicles, mud-swallowed tracks. Jungle didn't care how thick your armor was if it could trap you, isolate you, turn you into a stationary target. But by May 24th, as the Australians established the sister base, FSB Balmoral, the Centurions arrived, and everything changed. Psychologically, the battlefield shifted the moment those tanks rumbled into view. M113 APCs, like the ones at Long Tan, were armored taxis. Useful, fast, vulnerable. A Centurion was a predator, thick armor, a 20-pounder main gun that could smash a bunker in a single shot. A presence that didn't merely defend, it threatened. The NVA was not intimidated. On the night of May 25th, the NVA 165th Regiment launched a ferocious assault on Balmoral. They wanted to prove their RPG-7 and B-40/B-41 rockets could neutralize Australian armor, that steel could burn like anything else. Bugles sounded, whistles cut the night, human waves surged forward again, organized, determined, willing to pay in bodies for a breach. Balmoral became a firelit struggle where the ground itself seemed to tremble. And here, the coordination between tanks and infantry became a masterclass in combined arms. The Centurions didn't sit still like pillboxes. They moved inside the perimeter, slow, deliberate hunting movement, using massive searchlights to blind oncoming infantry. White beams slashed across elephant grass, turning charging soldiers into silhouettes and shadows into traps. When the NVA tried to swarm the tanks to plant satchel charges, Australian infantry, trenched between the steel giants, cut them down with SLR fire, protecting the tank's softer sides. The infantry became the tank's skin. The tanks became the infantry's thunder. In return, the Centurions delivered their own version of beehive violence. Canister rounds that turned the main gun into a massive shotgun, spraying thousands of metal pellets across the front of the wire. The night filled with the sound of steel ripping air and bodies hitting earth. The enemy, accustomed to fighting infantry and light vehicles, suddenly faced moving armor that absorbed rocket hits with scorched paint and kept advancing anyway. Balmoral did more than hold. It broke something inside the attackers. The sight of those monsters emerging from smoke, indifferent to the chaos, sent a message the NVA couldn't ignore. Australia had brought industrial strength violence into a fight that the enemy wanted to keep at the level of flesh and rifles. Beyond the adrenaline of assaults, Coral and Balmoral evolved into a siege, a brutal test of endurance. For 26 days, the men lived under constant, rhythmic enemy fire. This wasn't hit-and-run guerrilla harassment. This was sustained bombardment by a professional army trying to grind nerves into powder. The NVA adopted a siege mentality. If they couldn't always overrun the bases, they could try to starve the defenders of sleep and sanity. Day and night, the thump of mortars and the whoosh of 122mm rockets became the soundtrack. Men lived in permanent hypervigilance. Every snap of a twig triggered cortisol. Every rustle of grass sounded like a scout crawling close. Sleep came in 20-minute snatches, sometimes in the mud at the bottom of a trench, rifle pressed to the chest like a child clinging to a blanket. The environment amplified everything. Bien Hoa Province was a pressure cooker of humidity. During the day, the sun hammered the cleared red earth of the bases, reflecting heat like an oven. Men baked, sweat-soaked uniforms until they stiffened with salt. Dust stuck to skin and became a second layer. They repaired bunkers and strung more barbed wire, knowing everything might be blown apart by sunset. There was no rear area at Coral, no safe corner. Every square inch was the front line. One veteran sergeant would later describe the emotional transition with grim honesty. You stop being afraid after the first week. You just become hollow. You watch the rockets come in like falling stars, and you hope it hits the guy next to you instead of your own hole. That hollowing produced the famous 1,000-yard stare, the vacant gaze of men who had stared too long into industrial-scale violence and found their emotions turning numb just to survive. And yet, discipline did not crack. Anzac's steel nerves held through routine and dark humor, through officers insisting on order even in a graveyard. Weapons were cleaned, rations were shared, positions were improved. Men learned to move automatically when the whistle of incoming fire changed pitch. They became a hardened, reactive organism, functioning on instinct, training, and brotherhood. The NVA hoped constant pressure would create unit collapse. They underestimated Australian stubbornness. While the North Vietnamese counted minutes and casualties, waiting for morale to snap, the Australians simply adapted to hell, until hell became normal. By early June 1968, when the guns finally began to fall silent, the landscape looked less like lush Vietnam and more like a torn, cratered wasteland. Red soil pocked with holes, jagged remnants of shells, scorched tracks where tanks had churned the earth, broken wire, splintered timber, the physical evidence of nearly a month of continuous combat. The Australians had held the line, but the cost was the highest the nation paid in a single operation during the Vietnam War. 25 Australians killed, nearly 100 wounded. For a force Australia's size, those numbers carried a heavy, cold weight. Infantry battalions, particularly 1 RAR and 3 RAR, had been stretched to the limit, and the men of 102 Field Battery had survived an ordeal that would become legendary inside the Royal Regiment of Australian Artillery. On the other side of the wire, the carnage was worse. Official counts were difficult in the jungle, but estimates suggest over 300 NVA soldiers killed and hundreds more wounded. The aftermath didn't feel like victory. There were no parades in the mud. There was only the exhausting work of identifying the fallen, tending the wounded, clearing the battered ground. Soldiers moved with the slow pace of men who had aged decades in less than a month. Uniforms were tattered, faces were drawn tight, eyes carried that thousand-yard stare like a permanent shadow. Strategically, Coral and Balmoral mattered. They helped block NVA regiments and disrupted preparations for a second offensive aimed at Saigon's heart. The victory wasn't measured in land gained. The fire bases were eventually dismantled and the bush reclaimed the red dirt, but in resilience, proof that Australian forces could survive and win a conventional high-intensity battle against the NVA's best. They had faced the fireball in the dark and did not blink. And yet, for decades, Coral Balmoral remained a ghost in Australia's national consciousness. Overshadowed by Long Tan's clean dramatic arc, this battle was harder to hold in the mind. It was a grinding siege without a neat ending. It was attrition, exhaustion, and the slow accumulation of trauma. Less cinematic, more honest. Part of its forgotten status came from the war back home. By May 1968, public support for Vietnam was fracturing. The news coming out of Bien Hoa wasn't a heroic underdog story. It was the reality of sustained combat, bodies, rockets, and young men living in holes. The government, wary of rising anti-war sentiment, did not amplify the full scale of the sacrifice. So the veterans returned to a country increasingly indifferent or hostile, and their struggle became something whispered among soldiers and buried in archives rather than celebrated in public. But in military doctrine, Coral Balmoral never faded. It became a masterclass in defensive fire support, proof that the airmobile fire base concept worked, if it was anchored by the raw courage of gunners, the discipline of infantry, and the iron fist of armor. Proof that when infantry, artillery, and tanks function as one organism, they can endure an enemy 10 times their size. And in 2018, on the battle's 50th anniversary, the Australian government finally awarded a unit citation for gallantry to participants of Coral Balmoral. A belated recognition, a formal admission that these men had faced the most sustained and intense combat of the war. The legacy of Coral and Balmoral is a reminder that glory isn't always found in quick victory. Sometimes it's found in the quiet, grim determination to hold your ground when the world is exploding around you. When rockets fall like meteor showers, when sleep is stolen in minutes, when your hands shake as you load another round because the next wave is coming. The jungle ghosts of Long Tan may have the fame, but the Iron Men of Coral Balmoral have the respect of every professional soldier who understands what it truly costs to hold a fire base in hell. They prove something simple and terrifying. The Australian soldier does not break. He digs deeper, waits for the barrage to end, and prepares for the next charge.